I was thinking about our subject tonight, which is aging and aging with grace and with health. And the poem I picked tonight is from Dr. Babette Rani, who practices out of the University of Colorado School of Medicine. And this poem was published in the Medical Honor Society publication called The Pharos. And it's called Tree at the Edge of the Canyon. And a few years ago, I traveled into the Grand Canyon off the North Rim, and it was the toughest backpacking experience I've ever had. And you know, those trees that are right along the rim have seen and weathered so much, but they still hold there on the rim. So let's listen to Dr. Rani. Tree at the edge of the canyon. Maybe someday I'll stand, thickened and bent by the experience of living on the brink of awesome history, and comprehend what I am, where I am, who I am, and why, even as my root hold against the void crumbles, and I say silent farewell to the people around me, whom I appreciated, but never knew how to know. Be active, it's never too late, which I'm glad because my exercise habits have gone by the wayside since medical school. So you guys, at the very least, motivate me to do something about this. This very handsome fisherman, Dr. Abrass, is a professor and division head of the Gerontology and Geriatric Medicine service in the UW School of Medicine. He received his MD degree from the University of California, San Francisco, an absolutely premier institution. He's board certified in internal medicine, and if that weren't enough, geriatric medicine, and if that weren't enough, endocrinology and metabolism. He's one of the gifted gerontologists at our own Harborview Medical Center, and his research is in geriatric endocrinology and pharmacology. And he studied the impact of exercise on the cardiovascular function of the elderly. And in 2003, he was awarded the very prestigious Joseph T. Freeman Award by the Geriatric Society of America for research and practice in the field of aging. After Dr. Abrass, we're going to see and hear from Dr. McCormick, and Dr. McCormick is professor and chief of the long-term care service, Gerontology and Geriatric Medicine, the UW School of Medicine. He received his MD degree from the other Washington University in St. Louis, and his master's in public health from UW. He's board certified in internal medicine, geriatric, public health, and general preventive medicine. And he's the medical director of the evaluation and research of the Bailey Boucher House, which does some fantastic work, including in the hospice area. And he believes in holistic care and works primarily with patients with multiple chronic illnesses. He's established numerous community affiliations to improve patient care and conduct research and training in long-term care. So with that, you guys, let's welcome Dr. Abrass to the podium.
Well, good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm glad you're here. I guess I thought you'd be watching the Olympics tonight. I would have thought, Terry, that the Olympics would have been enough of a stimulus for your exercise program. But if that wasn't enough, hopefully some of the things we say today may stimulate all of you to do so. By the way, on Friday at our geriatric conference, someone asked me about what we were going to talk about today, and I said, I was going to say that exercise was good for you, and so that person asked me what I did, and I must tell you, I do what I preach. I do row every morning, and I have a weight machine at home and do that as well. So, Terry, you got to do it.
I drive to Krispy Kreme
I know.
twice a week.
You drive to Renton. So, people people in our discipline, several experts, have put together some thoughts about what some of the important things are in healthy aging, and I just thought I'd go through that list with you. Different people have different concepts, but here are some of the important things. I put maintain social contacts at the top because I think that along with the last one I'm going to show you are probably the most important. The MacArthur Foundation had a very large study on what they called successful aging. And when you look at the things that they came out to define, almost all of them related to social issues rather than what you might have thought related to disease and illness. If you smoke, stop smoking. Depression is another issue. Preventing bone loss and muscle weakness are important. Controlling blood pressure, controlling blood sugar, and we'll talk a lot about these. Lower LDL cholesterol, get cancer screening, get regular immunizations, and be active. And I think if you look at this list, being active actually contributes to almost all of these. And if you're active, you're more likely to go get your cancer screening, because if you're not active, you won't do that, and you won't go see anybody about your immunizations either. So I think the most important things on this list really relate to social interactions and being active, and we'll talk a lot about how that impacts some of the other things on this list. I want to discuss a couple of concepts with you that I think are important that I'll keep coming back to. One is the concept of the half-empty or half-full glass. Clearly, there are changes that occur with aging. One could look at that as a decrement, or one could say, well, look how wonderful it still is. But as I go through it, I'll show you where some of the changes do occur and how well some older individuals really can do. The other part in a lot of this information is the horse and cart concept. And that is, clearly people who are older who run marathons do so and are probably healthier than those that are sedentary. It's hard to tell from that group whether they're older because they ran marathons or they ran marathons because they were healthy and older to start with. So as I go through some of the information, I'll try to separate for you where we know that exercise actually does make a difference, as opposed to just looking at the issue of, well, people who exercise are healthier. So here's the first thing about the half-full, half-empty glass. If you look at this slide, you'll see on the first line, men, the record marathon as of last week, this is the last time I looked it up, for men, the record at any age is 2 hours, 4 minutes, 55 seconds. And for women, 2 hours, 15 minutes. You can see at age 70, there's clearly a slower time, but that's an awfully good time. That still puts these people in the top of any marathon runner. So even at age 70, both for the men and the women, and you look at age 80, and you're still only at 3 hours, 43 minutes and 4 hours, 30 minutes for the women. And at 90, here's a 92-year-old who ran the marathon at 5 hours, 40 minutes. There aren't a lot of people, no matter what age, who really run at that rate. And here it's a little bit slower for a 90-year-old woman. So the point is that clearly people, as they get older, can still perform at very, very high levels, but they still can't perform the way they did at their 20s and 30s. So there are decrements, and that's the whole issue of the half-empty, half-full glass. A few misconceptions. First of all, I think people think of aging being associated with the disease and loss of function, and that those changes are inevitable. And I'm going to show you today that I don't think that's true. And they also believe it's the result of the aging process, for which, at least at the moment, for the real aging process, we probably don't have much of an intervention, and will probably depend on, in the future, on genetic manipulation to make a difference in what the actual aging process is. But there's more to this. The other is that there is truly physical decline and reduced reserve as people get older. There is a complex interaction of multiple factors. Clearly, genetics play a role. People estimate that, however, at only about 20% of what it contributes to the changes we see in physical decline and reduced reserves. Clearly, diseases are associated with aging, and as people get older, they have more chronic diseases, and that contributes to their changes. But importantly, disuse is a major factor, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Again, aging is associated with loss of endurance. That means activity of how long you can do a certain activity, strength and flexibility. There are those changes, and they do occur. But inactivity contributes to all of this. So the physiology of aging is influenced by inactivity, disease is influenced by inactivity, and the overall functional ability of any given individual is influenced by inactivity. So let's talk about endurance first. Endurance exercise capacity. The way we decide what someone's endurance is and their ability is measured by how much oxygen they consume during their maximal exertion. So when they exercise to the maximal capacity, we want to know what their oxygen consumption is. And there is an age-related decline to this, even in those marathon runners that you saw, and certainly one of the things that contributes to their slower time is that their exercise capacity, endurance capacity has declined. This decline that occurs in aging is not as steep in athletes. So these athletes that I showed you don't have the same decline in their oxygen consumption as do sedentary individuals. However, if somebody is an athlete and a marathon runner and they stop exercising at the same level, their decline of oxygen consumption or their endurance actually declines faster than sedentary individuals. So although sedentary individuals decline over their whole lifespan, athletes, if they stop exercising, although they don't quite catch up with them, will have a pretty steep decline, and they do almost catch up with those that have never exercised before. So keeping your exercise is important. It's not just doing it, it's also continuing it. So the other thing is what contributes to our ability to maintain this oxygen capacity? Well, part of that is cardiac output, namely how much blood your heart can put out to the different tissues that need it while you're exercising. Then the muscle needs to extract that oxygen so it can use it. But what happens is that muscle mass decreases with aging, and there's also an increase in fat, and unfortunately most of it goes to the central part. And we'll talk a little bit more about that because that's where you don't really want your fat. Not that you want to get fat in the first place, but central adiposity is the one that's associated with many of the chronic diseases we'll talk about. And that's what happens as people get older. Now, what are some of these changes that do occur? A lot of the changes in aging in healthy individuals occur really only under stressful situations. So at rest, if we look at cardiac output, heart rate, heart size, those are all normal in older individuals, even when they're sedentary as they get older, if they're at rest. However, there is a change that does change with aging, and that is that the large blood vessels, things like the aorta and the other blood vessels, get stiffer. And as they get stiffer, the heart has to work harder to compensate to beat against that stiffness. So even at rest, there are changes. The changes are such that the heart can keep up with it, so the cardiac output remains the same, heart rate remains the same, and the heart size remains the same. But when you stress the organism, so here it is doing exercise, the maximal heart rate that an older individual can reach while they're exercising decreases. The heart doesn't contract as well, and therefore there's a decrease in their cardiac output. So that part of the equation that relates to endurance capacity, namely the cardiac output, falls off as older individuals age. And as I said, this happens less in those who exercise and is more marked in those who are sedentary. The important thing is that people who are sedentary who begin to do exercise as they get older and do endurance exercise increase their oxygen consumption, and the amount that they increase it is the same as taking a young individual who's sedentary, putting them into an endurance exercise program. An older individual will have the same increase if they do the same amount of work. So the good news is that although there is a decline, it is reversible, and it is not inevitable, and it does relate to the capacity of the individual to exercise. The other thing we know is that those who are well-trained, in other words, these marathoners, have higher cardiac output. And as I said, we don't know in that situation whether their higher cardiac output allows them to be marathoners or whether the marathon allows them to have a higher cardiac output. But if you take older individuals who are sedentary and you put them into a training program, they will increase their output. Now, it turns out that men do this better than women. That's the bad news for women. Women, even when they endurance train, don't get the same benefit in cardiac output. Don't misunderstand. They get lots of benefits from exercise. But at least as far as cardiac output is concerned, the improvement is much more marked in men than it is in women. What about muscle strength? Muscle strength clearly declines as people get older. What we call muscle power declines even more. Muscle power is a timed strength test, so that if you need to move some weight, part of that measurement relates to how quickly you can do it. So not only do you lose strength as you get older, but you can't do it as well or as quickly. So that we measure power, and it appears that that's important from a functional perspective. Strength alone has an influence on how people function physically, but power has a greater influence. So the muscle mass declines. People lose muscle. The other thing they lose is the nervous input to the muscle. There are nerve endings that end right on the muscle that lead to muscle contraction. These are called the motor units, and those also decline with aging. So not only do you lose muscle mass, but you also lose the nervous input to control contraction and strength. Well, what about strength training? It's clear that you can take people who are weak and increase their strength. This has been demonstrated in very frail older individuals. Maria Fiatarone, who was on the Harvard faculty when she did this, took some middle 80s women who basically were in a nursing home and walked from their bed to the day room, and that was about their whole capacity. Not one of them could walk to the second floor of that nursing home. They couldn't make it up those stairs. She put them through a very simple exercise program where they sat in a chair and had a pulley weight for their legs, and over a period of time they got stronger, and actually got strong enough that the group could actually walk to the second floor. As soon as that program ended, of course, they all lost it again, because there was really no reason for them to walk to the second floor. So another important thing about doing exercise is you want to do the exercise so you gain something from it. It's hard to just exercise. So, if you tell somebody they're going to improve their golf stroke because they're, avid golfers, they're likely to do it because they might actually see a benefit. So there needs to be some stimulus to be able to do this and to maintain it. But it is important to note that these people were about as frail as you could possibly be, and yet they benefited from the strengthening program. Had they actually needed to become stronger, they could have. Intensity is the most important factor, so the stronger you want to get, the more intense your exercise has to be. Unfortunately, the increase in power, namely the time through which you can do that same weightlifting, it doesn't improve quite as much, but it does improve. There is an increase in muscle mass and also a gain in these neuronal inputs into the end plates. So there's a benefit both for the muscle itself and to the nervous system for doing strength exercises. So the other thing, of course, that relates to this is the functional capacity. The physically active individuals are less likely to decline in their ability to do their daily function. Interventions, though, depend on the group you do it in. So again, the more frail the individual, the more likely they are to benefit from an intervention to improve their function. So the frail benefit the most, and you need fairly complex tasks for healthy older individuals to demonstrate that the exercise program is making them better. But the exercise program, as I told you, the active individuals are less likely to decline. So although you may not demonstrate the immediate benefit in the healthier individuals, you do improve their overall capacity, and their decline is slowed. Now, the other thing I think that's important relates to the body composition, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the chronic diseases. Physically active individuals have less fat. The important thing is that exercise decreases fat, and particularly what I said, the central adiposity. We're talking about chest and abdomen, and that's where the fat is in inactive individuals. The interesting thing is that overall, if you do endurance exercise, namely you walk, you jog, you swim, you don't increase your free fat mass. Namely, you decrease your fat, but you don't necessarily increase your other tissues. You need to do strength exercises to actually increase your muscles. So why are all of these physiological changes so important? So we'll talk about some of the chronic diseases and why this makes a difference. So as I already told you, inactivity is associated with central adiposity, but it turned, and most people, as they get older, develop insulin resistance and what we call glucose intolerance. What happens is that for any given amount of insulin, the insulin moves less glucose into the tissues and therefore is not utilized as well. And the blood sugar then can rise, and that's what we call the glucose intolerance. Well, well-trained individuals have normal insulin and glucose. So we know those who exercise regularly are less likely to develop this. And we also know that exercise improves insulin sensitivity. More importantly, there have now been several studies, and one very large one that was published fairly recently, is that exercise prevents the development of type 2 diabetes. So if you take people who are at high risk for development of diabetes and put them into an exercise program, you decrease their development of type 2 diabetes. So the prevention part is really pretty critical, and it turned out that the study was done with a drug, metformin, and with exercise. In younger individuals, those under 55, exercise was better than metformin, but metformin had an effect. For those who were 65 and over, the drug had no effect. The only thing that really benefited the older individuals was exercise. So there was no magic bullet. And it turned out that the people who exercised had a 50% reduction in development of diabetes during the time of this study. So it was pretty remarkable for the people over the age of 65 who were in this exercise program. The other part that exercise does is it does increase HDL cholesterol, and particularly the fraction that we think is most important in reducing the risk for coronary artery disease. So people who exercise actually do increase their HDL. The other thing is related to hypertension. Individuals who are more fit, those who exercise regularly, have a reduced development of hypertension. And again, this is a very significant effect. Exercise training alone in those who already have high blood pressure has a small effect on blood pressure. It's not insignificant, but it's relatively small. But in preventing hypertension, exercise is very important. So again, I'm trying to emphasize the whole issue of how exercise is important in preventing decline and disease. What about cardiovascular disease? There's clearly a reduction in heart attacks in active individuals. There's also reduced all-cause mortality. So those who are active die of other diseases at any given age, less than those who are inactive. What about arthritis? People always worry about arthritis, and they think that exercise is going to make their arthritis worse. Well, actually, exercise is beneficial in arthritis. That doesn't mean you want to beat up the joint that has arthritis in it, but if you do exercise and strengthen the muscle around that joint, you actually improve your arthritis. It improves physical function, people have less pain, and they have lower depression scores, because people who have chronic arthritis and chronic pain are often have high depression scores, even if they don't make the diagnosis of depression. So actually, exercise improves all of these things. What about osteoporosis? Osteoporosis is a major problem, particularly for women, but also for men as they get older, particularly in the immediate postmenopausal time for women, and both for men and women as they get older. And it turns out that mechanical loads on the bone are very important in maintaining bone structure. And weight-bearing endurance exercise and resistance exercise actually improve bone density or prevent bone loss. And it does need to be weight-bearing, so swimming, for example, would not benefit bone so much. So it needs to be weight-bearing, and it needs to be resistance. So people who do strengthening at the hip, strengthening exercise at the hip, actually increase bone density at the hip. People who wear backpacks as they walk up the stairs will increase the bone density of their spine. What about cancer? I think there's some interesting data related to that. Again, there's reduced colon cancer in the people who are most active. There's also reduced breast cancer in women who are most active. And then more recently, there was a study that was done at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center that demonstrated that if you took women and put them into an exercise program, they had a reduced incidence of breast cancer. So I think, again, as opposed to just looking at the issue of what's different about people who exercise who don't get breast cancer, people who exercise, who then pick up exercise also have less of an incidence of breast cancer. So again, the whole issue of preventing disease by being active. What about rehabilitation? Well, clearly, exercise has a major benefit in coronary artery disease, and after individuals either have an event or are diagnosed with coronary artery disease, they benefit from exercise and reduce their risk of progression. Peripheral vascular disease, people who have cramps in their calves when they walk, for example, benefit the most, not from the drugs we have, but actually from exercise programs that assist in improving their blood flow. Even patients with heart failure benefit from exercise programs. So individuals who are significantly short of breath and intolerant of exercise, if they get into an exercise program, actually improve their overall function and improve their heart failure. And clearly the same thing is true in pulmonary disease. Patients who participate in rehabilitation improve their exercise tolerance as they go through the programs. So how should you do this? Assuming some of you aren't all exercising, including Tara here. Well, I think the important thing is, what we always say in our discipline is you start low and you go slow. It's important not to get into a program if you've not exercised regularly and be over-exuberant. And usually we try to gauge this by doing an estimate of maximal heart rate, and we go by percentage of that. The best way to do this, of course, is to do a true treadmill and measure your oxygen consumption and all. That's clearly not a public health intervention that everybody would go through. Nor, I think, unless you're symptomatic with coronary artery disease, you really need to do a stress test before you do the kind of exercise I'm talking about. If you're asymptomatic, you really don't need to go through a stress test. But you should really estimate what your maximal heart rate is. And the way we generally do this, there are several formulas. This is one of the simpler ones. Is you take 220 minus your age. So that's your approximate maximal heart rate. And you probably should be starting at 50 to 60% of that. So you measure your heart rate, and you should be doing it at about 50 to 60%. And then you go up from there to about 80%. You get to about 80%, and you're going to get a significant effect on endurance if you get to that level. But again, it's an issue of going slow and starting at a low level and increasing the increments at a low level. And I think you all can do that, and I think you would all benefit from it. So I think I'll stop there and let Dr. McCormick carry on, because he's going to tell you about a specific intervention that seems to make a big difference.
job. Okay. Well, again, I'm overjoyed you all have come. And what I'm going to do is take off from Itamar's talk about exercise generally and talk a little bit about how it applies to memory maintenance in particular. Several weeks ago, a study came out that we participated in that had to do with delaying the onset of Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia via the mechanism of exercise. And I'm going to describe that study tonight to you and talk a little bit about how it was done so you have a good feel for it. But it got a fair amount of press a few weeks ago, and so it may sound a little bit familiar to you. So let me talk about that generally as a takeoff point about how exercise may actually improve memory characteristics of older individuals. But before I do that, let me highlight what Dr. Abrass said and what Dr. Legefro is going to say, what I'm going to say too, a little bit about the phenomenon of aging societies and the fact that that's a fairly new phenomenon. This is the first sentence in the geriatric section of the most popular textbook of medicine, written by a friend of Itamar's and mine named Neil Resnick. And I think it's fairly profound, and I'd like us to think about it for a minute, because it's a true statement. And that is, of all people who have ever lived to age 65, more than half are now alive. So if you think about that for a minute, that's an amazing thing, that people simply didn't live much past what we now consider middle age, a century ago, and certainly much less even before that. The turn of the last century, 1900, the average life expectancy was in the mid-40s. It's now well into the 70s and into the 80s in most modern societies. So it's almost a ecological impact of the aging society. The mission statement of geriatrics, in a sense, is we'd like to make people live long, healthy, and functional lives. And a surprising statistic that was accrued just at the end of the last millennium, at 2000, from the National Center for Health Statistics, is that a substantial majority of persons over the age 75 are completely healthy, have no functional debility or cognitive debility. A majority, a solid majority. So the thinking about, which Dr. Abrass also alluded to, that when we think of aging and connecting it with disease and debility, that's not a true idea of aging. And that's not the idea of aging that we would like to promulgate. Our idea as geriatricians, again, is to approximate this ideal. I mean, what we'd like to do is to have people live to a ripe old age and then promptly croak. And when we've achieved that goal, we will have succeeded. We can take our bats and balls and go home. We're done. But seriously, I mean, in 1900, you see this fading percent surviving. Think of this also as a function curve. We'd like people to maintain their function and their cognition till a ripe old age. We embrace and accept the fact that the mortality of Homo sapiens remains 100%, that we're all going to go sometime. But we want all those years to be high-quality years. That's what this session's about tonight. So let me talk a little bit now about how physicians think about dementia and memory impairment, because you might think about it differently than we do. So I'd like to highlight how we make the diagnosis of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is just one form of dementia. Dementia being a fundamental impairment in thinking ability. Not just memory, but other types of thinking. When Itamar and I are in clinic together, or Jim, and a person comes to us with a memory complaint, we take that as a cue. So here's some cues of types of memory problems that people complain about and worry about when they come to see us and are worried that they might have Alzheimer's disease. Sometimes people are worried about learning and retaining new information. They can't hold on to instructions and get through things like they once did. When complex tasks come up, they feel an inability to complete them well or feel like they're lost and don't even want to start doing them. They might lose reasoning ability and thinking through problems. They may have gotten lost in a familiar place or have spatial orientation problems. Language complaints is a very common one. People who have word finding problems. Well, they get to the middle of a sentence and can't find the word they want. Is worrisome to many people, and they worry about that as a symptom of Alzheimer's disease or dementia. Or behavior, if they're feeling a little more angry or touchy than they once were. Sometimes loved ones worry that that might be a symptom of a dementing illness. Or things like these, like concrete things like failure to make an appointment on time or forgetting an appointment. We search through kind of areas of interest that people might have forgotten or thought about just to assess the general intake of things that they might have experienced during the past week or two as indicators of difficulties with memory. One simple test we use is something called the mini mental state exam. And I just use this as an example. It's a test of a number of different types of thinking, like orientation, what's the date today, what year is it, if they can remember a few objects like pencil, chair, newspaper, and then you ask them to remember that because you're going to ask them again. And then we do some calculations, ask them the things again for recall, and ask them some language tests. That's just one test. There's a number of good tests that we use as a screen to see if there is, in fact, significant difficulties with memory. And then we think through the diagnostic criteria for Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. So even if somebody is impaired on this mini mental state exam test, for instance, that doesn't necessarily mean they have a dementia. It may be that they have a sensory impairment or a vision impairment or a motor impairment. Or it may be that they had a very low level of education, less than 8th grade. Or, importantly, in an area like Seattle, where we're very multicultural, it may be that they come from a different cultural background and this test doesn't perform as well for them. One thing that I would like to point out of these different types of cues or symptoms is an important one has to do with reaction time. One of the main things that we see people worried about as they age and worry about their memory has to do with reaction time, and I'll describe that to you, which is not necessarily a symptom of a dementing illness or cognitive impairment. Let's say it's Saturday and you're trying to repair something in the house and you need the screwdriver. So you get up and you go out in the garage and you say, now why did I come out here? Oh yeah, the screwdriver. And you go get it. Now that was a reaction time of 2 seconds, okay? So now let's expand that a little bit. And this is a delay in reaction time, which is a normal consequence of aging and not necessarily an indicator of dementia. So I'm fixing something Saturday morning and I'm going out to the garage to get the screwdriver, and I get out there and I say, let's see, why did I come out here? What was it? Dag nabbit. What was it? Jesus. Oh yeah, the screwdriver. Okay, that was a delay of 7 seconds. Not very long, right? I mean, 7 seconds, what's the big deal? Just long enough to start worrying about your memory, okay? And so we have a lot of people complaining of that, but that's a problem of reaction time. That's not a lost memory. That's a retained memory that just takes a little longer to access. Okay, now here's the actual diagnostic criteria for Alzheimer's disease. So when we're sitting in clinic and someone comes with a memory complaint and they have a cue, like let's say they have this reaction time problem or they have trouble with word finding, and we do the test, and let's say they do have significant impairment, then we think through these criteria. It's all by history. This is without any tests, any blood tests, or any CAT scans or MRI tests. We think, do they have memory impairment? Are they having trouble remembering things? Do they have trouble with aphasia, which is the doctor's word for language difficulty? Apraxia, difficulty with motor skills. Agnosia, difficulty remembering names or faces. Or disturbance of executive functioning, putting things together and completing complex tasks. And now this is an important piece. Significant impairment in thinking that interferes with and represents a significant decline from a previous level of functioning in occupational or social functioning. So you can see that the diagnosis of dementia is actually function-based in thinking and social functioning. And then for Alzheimer's disease, usually it's a gradual and insidious progressive cognitive decline. So when we're evaluating somebody for thinking problems and dementia, it's primarily a mental experiment on our part that we just do sitting with a person in clinic and with their loved ones, but primarily through a thorough history. And to some extent a physical exam is mostly a history-based diagnosis, okay? Now there's lots of different causes of dementia, and this is a bit of a confusing graph, but I like it because it's kind of a rainbow effect. About 2/3 of dementias generally, which is a syndrome, it's just a syndrome of loss of thinking ability, is due to Alzheimer's disease. So that's the commonest cause of dementia. There's lots of other causes, like having multiple little strokes that additively interfere with thinking the same way or similarly that Alzheimer's disease does. And there's a new entity called Lewy body dementia, which is a new type of dementia that's really come to the fore over the past decade or so. How many of you heard of Lewy body dementia? A substantial number of you. This is just to show you that there's lots of different causes of dementia that we think through, although our fundamental approach to taking care of someone with dementing illness, including Alzheimer's disease, is somewhat similar, and that is to offer community support, to build up the infrastructure around that person so they can function better and better over time. And that's where the exercise component comes in. So now that I've told you a little bit about how we make the diagnosis of dementia, let me talk a little bit about our recent study having to do with observed exercise over time in a large cohort of people here in Seattle. And these are the colleagues of mine, Eric Larson, Lee Wang, Jim Bowen, Linda Terry, Paul Crane, and Bud Kukul, who helped complete this study. This study was based in Group Health Cooperative, a very large HMO that I would guess a substantial number of you in the audience are members of Group Health. And for this study, it's a study that began in the early and mid-90s called the Aging Changes in Thought Study, where the purpose was to enroll healthy people who were healthy in function and thinking and cognition, and to just follow them forward in time, to not necessarily intervene, but just watch them, not only for changes in their thinking, but changes in their function as well. So for this particular study, we concentrated on 1,740 persons over 65 to find if regular exercise was associated with a reduced or increased risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And as I mentioned, they were all healthy and normal function at the beginning of the study. And in describing this study, for those of you who are here who may be group health members or maybe even were participants in this study, I think it's good for us to all realize what a wonderful gift it is when people participate in a study like this. Even though they're just enrolling and being watched over time, the legacy they live through altruistically giving of their time is substantial. If we can find out little things that are going to help us live better in the future, what a gift that is. So I'd like to just thank the participants in this study for doing so, for participating. So they all started out normal cognitive function and normal physical function by and large, although that was not the initial intent. The initial intent was that they didn't have any problems in thinking. Some of them did have some performance problems, and that becomes important as I describe the results of the study. So baseline measurements were taken in the early 90s, which included exercise frequency, cognitive function, physical function, depression on a scale of measurement of depression, health conditions, like if they had heart disease, pulmonary or respiratory disease, or other types of conditions, diabetes, for instance. Lifestyle characteristics, like how they used alcohol or smoking, dietary supplements, those kinds of things. And other potential risk factors, dementia, certain genetic markers, family history, those kinds of things. and each had a follow-up assessment for dementia every couple of years. This was an NIH study. So we monitored their activities carefully and reassessed them at regular intervals over time. Some of these folks were remarkably healthy. How many of you can do this? I see no hands. Okay. So during a mean follow-up of over 6 years, only 158 of them developed dementia of any type, the majority of which were Alzheimer's disease. It's about 2/3, and that's what we find over and over again in studies of dementia, that 2/3 of the cases generally are Alzheimer's type dementia. Here's the interesting finding. About a third, the incidence rate of dementia was about a third lower among subjects who exercised 3 times a week or more, and was particularly pronounced among those who started with lower performance levels, highlighting what Dr. Abrass said a little bit, that you can gain more even if you're starting at kind of a lower level. That's kind of fascinating. It's, for reasons that we aren't entirely clear about, it seems that for people who exercised, the incidence rate was lower. So let me flesh that out a little bit for you. The way we count these things in epidemiologic studies is we add up the number of people and years they've been followed, and the denominator is something called person years. So a person followed for a whole year is 1 person year. So the incidence rate, that is the occurrence of a new diagnosis of dementia, was about 13 per 1,000 person years for persons who were exercising 3 or more times a week, compared to just short of 20 per 1,000 person years for those who exercise less or not at all. And importantly, the risk reduction associated with exercise was greater for those who started at a lower performance level. So that probably has something to do with delaying the diagnosis because people remain functional because they remain active. So, important findings here. The more frail a person is, the more he or she seems to benefit from exercise with regards to the incidence of dementing illness. And even modest amounts of exercise can help. So for the folks who did as little as just walking for 15 minutes a few times a week seemed to benefit. Not much. Unlike previous studies like this, and there have been a number of studies like this, we took extra steps at the beginning to ensure that participants hadn't already started to lose function. I told you before that we started with people who were as healthy as possible, particularly cognitively. And then we eliminated the bottom quarter of those. So even though they were all healthy, we took off the bottom quarter anyway. So we saved the top 3/4 of the highest functioning group. We actually started out with over 2,500 people and winnowed it down to 1,740. So we enrolled people who showed no evidence of impairment in those who scored an elaborate brain and memory tests. I think doing this makes the results more credible because the participants who might be developing Alzheimer's disease but not yet showing signs of it were not likely to be included in the study at onset. So it's very reasonable to try to maintain some simple levels of activity as we age, and very little amounts of exercise seems to be remarkably helpful. There's a lot of important reasons to exercise regularly, and now we have one more. And it's never too late to start. Even if you've never been active, it's reasonable to engage in modest exercise like the types I've described. Even gentle forms of exercise, like walking, swimming, or yoga can help. Vacuuming. This is the UW rowing team, about age 20. I mean, these are extremely active, high-functioning, the marathoners that Dr. Abrass were describing a minute ago. And here's their 50-year reunion, about age 70. And you see they've lost 1 or 2 of the members, but it's a tribute to the fact that people can remain active throughout life. And maybe it's because they were active early that they've been able to maintain this. But my tenet tonight is it's never too late to start. So thanks very much for your time.
you.